at the end of the NRC movement. I went to that part of Delhi, but I came very close to a gang that was quite a scary encounter. I've been in a lot of risky situations before, but it was the first time that I was in a situation that felt dangerous and sort of shocked my system a little bit. And then it took me a little while to recover.
Hi everyone, welcome to Chalchitra Talks. मेरा नाम वाणी है and this is another one of our guest episodes. इस episode में मेरे साथ हैं Raghu Karnad, who is a journalist and writer. We spoke about Bangalore, we spoke about music, books and so much more. Also journalism. So without wasting further time, let's just jump right in. Hi Raghu, welcome to Chalchitra Talks.
Hi, Vani. Thank you very much.
I hope you're doing well and I hope
Yeah,
you're having a relaxed day.
This is a very nice thing to be doing on a Saturday afternoon in the summer. So all the blinds are down and the AC is on.
I want to jump right into it and I just want to ask you, who are your favorite interviewers in the country?
Interviewing is a really interesting skill. I know this because obviously I'm a journalist and most of what the interviewing I do is for print. As anyone whose profession involves listening to their own voice will know, it's an absolutely like harrowing thing. So when I transcribe my own interviews, I have to listen to what I sound like asking questions. And it's a tough job. I have to, so kudos to you guys. I have to sort of shout out to some of the people who I work with, like Arfa Khanum. I think she's a fantastic interviewer. I mean, I'm just in awe of how she is as a presenter in general and her ability to both monologue and to draw other people out. The other person who is now a pillar of the Wire's video presence is Karan Thapar. And I can say without any favoritism that he's one of the most impressive interviewers in the country because he has some eccentricities like the bow ties, but sometimes he can give a really tour de force like demonstration of how to ask tough questions and pursue the things that your interviewee doesn't necessarily want to talk about, but also kind of just get the whole story out of them. I like watching them. But the thing about interviews is there's many different kinds of conversations that are required to tell someone's story, and there are different styles of interviewers. So I don't think there's just anyone that I like.
You mentioned having difficult conversations, and I had this question for you. A lot of your work involves a lot of uncomfortable conversations or things that could make people uncomfortable. Have you learned how to make people comfortable when you are either addressing something, or is this something you deliberately try to do, or you just do not really, you just want to put your story out without really worrying about the comfort of other people?
I think that this is one of the deepest, murkiest areas of journalistic practice is what you do in an interview. There's a very famous she's a journalist and a writer about journalism named Janet Malcolm, I think. She wrote a book called The Journalist and the Murderer. And she really spotlighted how when someone goes in to get an interview from their subject, like I just said about Karan Thapar, your real objective is to get them to talk about the thing that they don't want to talk about, right? That's not universally true, but it is generally true. Often that means that in truth, so unless you're just kissing ass, I hope I can say that on the show, but which is of course a lot of what media is doing these days. The rest of the time you are play acting. You are sort of in many respects trying to manipulate within bounds and within rules of fair play your subject into telling you things that are difficult or are problematic for them, because that's the really interesting thing. This kind of can apply to all sorts of different interviews. Now, a lot of the writing I do, and including my last book, was about family memoirs. So I ran around kind of interviewing my family from my grandmother's generation, and also other families of people who had fought in World War II. The thing that you realize about family memoirs is that the best material that is the real beating heart of family stories is stuff that families don't talk about, right? That's just, that's also like India. So there's a heartbreak, there's a romantic affair, there's an illegitimate pregnancy, there's a suicide. All of this stuff is the stuff that is knocked out of the picture, and then you have to reach in through the interview and get it out of them, and then it's like a triumph. But of course, this is the general pattern. The material that is that brings human stories to life and often brings political situations to life is often the stuff that people want to conceal. So that takes a little bit of hard work, and it puts the journalist in a very sensitive, delicate position where you have to earn the trust of your subject, but you also have to work around them and kind of sneak up behind them a little bit.
And what is your relationship with music?
I don't listen to music as much as I used to, and as much as I'd like to. You get busier, and
Right.
I don't write while listening to music. I think there's a lot to learn from music, so I'm always sort of trying to make time to listen to music consciously the way I used to when I was younger. I would like lie down on my bed and listen to a new album from start to finish, and I kind of had the mental space to do that. And now I can't even imagine who that kid was that like had that those hours and that state of mind to do that. Now, we're just like banging on the one track we want to listen to and repeating it on Spotify. Music and writing have an interesting relationship. I think music can inform writing, and it can also just inspire your mood so obviously. Like nothing. There's someone someone famously said that all art aspires to the mode of music, something like that. That the ability to really touch the spirit of people is something music does so naturally, and that all other art is kind of is attempting to equal. And it's true. Even the most beautiful writing can only occasionally achieve. It can achieve many other things that music can't achieve, of course, which are form like meaning. But emotionally, music is amazing. So I'm still working on how to get more of it into my
And
life.
what were the bands that you were, or what was the music that you were listening to when you were growing up?
One of the bands that really like got into my head when I was in college was called the Arcade Fire, and that's coming back to mind because they finally have a new album out, which is a good one after many years. A lot of great musicians like Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam can really like move you, but then you look at the lyrics and you're like, what is he even talking about? It's all mystique. Like you just have to you have to it's like tarot, like your mood and this and some crazy stuff he's saying will kind of find some way to match. But as a writer, I'm a bit of a sucker for people who are also like writerly musicians. There was a lot of indie music people were listening to back then. You remember MGMT?
I
um, oh no, you don't. Oh my god. Well, they're clever, and they managed to write lyrics that spoke in fairly direct ways to some of the things we were feeling. And one of the things Arcade Fire did very early on was they started writing lyrics and songs that were about how we felt being like people who lived on the internet. They had an album called Reflector, and the first lines of the title song of Reflector are something like, trapped in a prison of light, alone in the darkness of night, we fell in love, alone on the page, in the reflective age. The reflective age is, of course, the fact that we are like, we're always looking at our dark reflections of our faces on our phones. And this, I thought, is beautiful. I'm still a big fan.
And it was the 90s, right?
No. Well, what I'm talking about there is like the late 2000s or maybe the early 2010s. When I was growing up, and it was the 90s, and growing up in Bangalore, I just listened to everything, all kinds of things. I mean, it was A.R. Rahman, it was Eminem, Sting, and all of the hits that were happening internationally back then that everyone listened to in school, and Paul Simon and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young. And I was a bit of a history geek even back then. So I liked listening to music from previous decades of the 20th century, which often was kind of referring to events in 20th century history. Like very famously, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young has a song called Ohio, which has this fantastic riff. It's an old song, and it's about the anti-Vietnam War protests when the US National Guard went and shot a bunch of students who were protesting against the war. I think this is the answer to your question. Okay, this is the answer to the question. I loved music that made me feel politically awakened and politically activated. I feel like a lot of that music disappeared, but when I was in high school and when I was in college, I used to listen to a lot of it that really excited me. Rage Against the Machine, I still think, is in some ways the coolest band that existed in the 90s because it was this ferociously political, like, protest band with the most amazing guitar work and riffs.
Do you also play any instrument? I'm just curious.
No, no, never did. That's the one place my creativity just didn't extend.
And what is your relationship with movies and documentaries?
That's an interesting question because my father was in the movies. If I had grown up in Bombay, I have a feeling that I'd have been someone with a very deep relationship to the film industry, just because that would have been the kind of mahal. Instead, I grew up in Bangalore, and Appa's film world was very much at a remove. I don't think of movies as being something that's close to my world. I think of theater as being something that the world I live in, and writing as being the world I live in. But movies, I just have spend less time watching movies than most people.
What was the most recent movie that really made you go, I need to watch it again, or oh, this just changed my perspective or showed me something in a new light?
I want to make a shout out for a new short that just came out, which I thought was extremely beautiful. I watched it when it was just done out of production and it hadn't been released yet. And it's called The Miniaturist of Junagadh. It stars Nasiruddin Shah. And it is based on a novel by Stefan Zweig, who is a mid-century German Jewish short story writer, brilliant genius. They've adapted it to being about pre-partition or partition era India and Junagadh. So it has many things. It has Nasir, who is possibly the greatest actor around, and it's beautifully shot. But it also has the thing that again I like most, which is it has that integrity of plot. Like it's a really good story. I think it just came out on YouTube, so that's a real recommendation. You can actually just go and watch it. The other movie that I watched recently was, there's been a lot of chat about a film called The Worst Person in the World, which is a Norwegian film by a director named Joachim Trier. I think that it got a lot of people's attention because it is about a young woman's life, and it's a sort of richly kind of shot and written and produced, but realistic private account of love, romance, and heartbreak. And it's like Sally Rooney in film. My wife can never watch a movie for more than 5 minutes before falling asleep. And then I was watching it on my own, and I thought, I want to watch a different film by this guy. And I got into Mubi. I found a film that he made years ago called Oslo, August 31st. That has some of the same cast, and it's about the first day that someone who's just come out of drug rehab after a very serious drug addiction, his first day back in the world. It's one of those films that I watched, and I watched it late into the night because we'd already watched half of this other film, right? It ended, and then I was like, okay, making art is worth it.
You mentioned marriage, and coincidentally, I'm reading a book called Hourglass. It's by Dani Shapiro. It's about marriage. It's about her author's relationship with her husband. And it's very bland. It just talks about the day-to-day affair. It's her collection of her diary entries, and she comments about them. And it just shows you, like, marriage. You think it'll be a lot of things happening. It'll be very entertaining as they show you in the movies.
Right.
Just fixing the sink one day and then just lying down on a Sunday evening all by yourself waiting for your husband. Nothing exciting about that. But the book nonetheless is very interesting. I think that is what makes it interesting.
That's a good recommendation for me. Thank you.
You also mentioned that you sometimes want to direct your creative energy, whether you want to be a journalist right now or whether you want to be a writer. How do you nurture that energy, and how do you decide what is the right time to pick what?
I think that this might have been quite unrelatable question back in the day, but it might be more relatable now just because so many more people are creators. To an extent, social media and this multiplicity of mediums makes everyone's creative focus and time fragmented, or threatens to fragment everyone's focus and time. So the last 2 years have been very interesting for me because in the last 2 years, I've found time to do more different kinds of writing and experimenting than I had ever done before. Because before I was either working on a book or working in a job. Over the course of the pandemic, I've probably I've found time to write song. I tried to write a song, had an idea that I really like for like a film. Apart from that, I've written some actual OTT pitches that were commissioned from me that were about World War II and stuff. I've written for the Times of India, just like column stuff. I've written serious stuff for The Wire. Having spent 2 years trying all sorts of different things, and more recently, since last year, felt a longing to create like a piece of art that requires sustained focus and attention and imagination and work. That's what I'm doing this coming year. I'm writing a book right now. I'm excited about also figuring out how to rearrange the world around me and the world in here so that I'm capable of writing a book which will hopefully potentially be a great book.
Do you look at writing as decluttering your thoughts?
I think it's sort of the other way around. I think that decluttering your thoughts might be the prerequisite to writing. That might be something that we kind of commonly mistake. I mean, look, if you're going to be journaling, then that is a great way to declutter your thoughts or to digest them. But if you want to write in a sustained or in a professional way, then often you need to declutter your thoughts ahead of doing that. And there are many things you can do. There's nothing works better than turning off your phone. When I hold down this button for long enough to feel my phone go off, I feel tension leave my body. It's amazing. I recently bought a little Nokia, one of the old Nokias, so that I can go to my library and write there and still be reachable. You have that. The problem with not being offline now is you're like, what if my mother has an emergency? So it's not going to happen, but you feel like you must be reachable. Fine. Now you have a little shitty little Nokia and you're reachable. So that's one way of decluttering your thoughts. Another is to meditate. I know that's like a very trendy thing to suggest on the internet. So I won't go into it. I'll just say that I buy it. I believe that helps. What we're talking about here is something that connects what writers have been longing for and searching for centuries, which is the quality of solitude that allows contemplation. This is something that goes back to antiquity.
We spoke about what kind of music and art and cinema inspire you. And I feel like you look at political conflicts or anything as something that inspires you to work more. What about your mental health? Are you able to take care of it? Does it get exhausting for you? Does it ever get remotely frustrating and you're like, okay, I'm done?
Yes, it does get remotely frustrating. And depending on what your involvement in it is, it also can get scary, can get very agitating, and it can really do a job on your nervous system. Part of why the last 2 years have been refreshing and different to me. It's been a lot of reasons, but not doing exclusively journalism has been good for my mental health. Among the Wire team, we ask after each other's mental health sometimes, because the trolling, sometimes the sense of threat, of risk is very, very real. At the end of the NRC movement, I went to that part of Delhi and I was, like a lot of reporters did, but I came very close to a gang that was quite a scary encounter. I've been in a lot of risky situations before, but it was the first time that I was in a situation that felt dangerous and sort of shocked my system a little bit. And then it took me a little while to recover. What I want to say that is very important is that there are many, many people who are doing much more risky and courageous kinds of journalism than I am.
What is your most favorite failure of yours? Something that really taught you a lot of things and you're grateful that you perhaps failed in that area or at that time?
I tried to write a novel and I spent like a whole summer working on some fiction that didn't go anywhere, and it still bugs me and it still burns me up. The failure was that I stopped. The failure was that I gave up. The failure is not when you do something and it comes out like not great. The failure is when you don't do it because you're afraid it's coming out not great. I've also failed at other things, which is like more mundane things, which teach you, when you fail at applications. I've applied for various sorts of fellowships and scholarships in my life. Many of them have been rejected. When I first sent my book, Farthest Field, to agents It was mostly rejections, and it was pretty scary. And then I was introduced to the right agents, and suddenly it was a whole different story. But coming back to the applications thing, one thing that I have been thinking about recently, because later this year, I'm moving to New York to start a fellowship at the New York Public Library to write a book. And I really didn't think I was going to get this fellowship. I still don't feel like I shouldn't talk about it. Like I might be jinxing it. Like it's not real yet, so maybe it's too soon. But I really believe that when you go out into the world trying to create something that you feel genuinely about, that genuinely moves you, the world kind of recognizes that in many ways. Maybe just application, juries recognize that. I definitely believe that I've tried to be clever and write and write applications for things, and just and try to hack it, and it never works. And anytime I've tried to do something that was actually genuine, it's typically come back to me positively. And I think that as a general principle, that really applies to a lot of things, which is that when you go out into the world asking for something genuine, you're quite likely to receive even more than you expected in return. But if you are asking for something contrived, you will typically find that it fails. And that doesn't mean that every failure is something that is contrived. I don't want to say that.
When I was growing up in school, there used to be this quote in the front page of, I think, of a moral science book or something, and it circles back to the first point that you made about failure. It's not the fall that kills you, but it's the sudden stop. You also mentioned everyone who comes on the channel we call them because of some sort of perceived success. What is the definition of success for you? And I asked this because I actually read an interview once where Tim Ferriss, who's a podcaster, had asked one of his guests, what is the definition of success for you? And the person replied, I think of my grandmother when, you ask me of success, because she spent 90% of her time doing what she loved and so less time doing what she did not like. And I think once you're successful, you can do more of what you like. And I think that is success for me. And what is it for you?
When you're in this field that I'm in, one of the very dangerous lures is to mistake popularity or fame of some kind for success. That can often lead you in exactly the wrong direction. When I wrote my book, I got so many different kinds of responses, and luckily for me, they were all mostly positive. I got reviews, I got a bump in my social media presence, I got interviewed, I got invited to Lit Fest, all of this stuff, right? Like a real kind of parade that lasted for way too long, because a lot of that was the superficial performance of success. The Lit Fest will just you're doing it for free most of the time, so they'll just keep inviting you back fforever. What felt like success, or what felt valuable more than anything else, was if anyone had read my book and written me an email to say, look, hey, I liked this, it was good, this is what I noted, this is what I read, this is what I how it connected with me. And then you feel that circle, when you really feel the circle close between what you've created, what purpose it served to someone else, and when they express it back to you, then you're just like, wow, well, that's what I'm here for. That's valuable. That feels real. I just want to say one thing, which I think more people should be aware of, which is that there are really highlighted forms of success that throw a spotlight on you, and then you become kind of you get attention. Half of the time, that stuff doesn't even feel particularly good. I'm not saying this to brag. I've received I've received some awards that if I had known a couple of years back I was going to receive them, I'd be like, oh my God, I'm so thrilled. But when it happened, some of this stuff doesn't feel thrilling. It's really hard to convey. And I think many of the people who you guys have interviewed, if you ask them something like this, and many people will agree, it's hard to convey how shockingly transient and short-lived and almost non-existent the thrill of success is, because as soon as you get it, you just you want something else. It's awful. But this other kind of success of really being seen through your work, and your work actually really being seen, that's real.
Nice.
That makes you happy.
I want to come back to books and reading now. And I want to ask you, what has your relationship been with reading?
I grew up in a house full of books. My father had a lot of books. My mother had a lot of books. My older sister then had a lot of books. I was blessed by one thing that I realize now one can't take for granted, which is that my mother read to us a lot. I loved reading as a kid. I was notorious as the kid who would go to family weddings and just sit there like reading Greek myths or something like that instead of playing with the other kids. When I was in high school, I would do a more pretentious version of that, which is that at least in my new school, I would like sit there and like read Nietzsche during the lunch. I'm not sure I was actually reading then. I was just making a point. Reading is my favorite thing. It's nothing. There's nothing I admire more than great writing, and that's something that the pandemic has actually brought back to me. I feel very lucky because I'm one of those people who was like, oh, can't go anywhere, and suddenly it was like books. I was just reading like suddenly these big fat books. I was just like eating my way through them, and it just felt so good. Like one of the best things that happened to me for the past 2 years is that I've been reading a lot.
What are the writers whose writing has really, really inspired you?
One person I've been reading over I have a long arc with is the Canadian writer Naomi Klein. She's a political writer and essayist who like burst out in the 1990s with a book called No Logo, which is about the kind of branding revolution and consumerism and the underlying thing that was happening to US, to capitalism in the West, which was that manufacturing was being sent to Asian countries. And the only thing that was increasingly being added in Western countries was brand value. And what that meant both for people like us, when it's like, for all of us, it really made sense if you were like a kid in Bangalore in the 90s, because suddenly brands were everywhere. It's like liberalization happened. Bangalore was a rich city, and suddenly it was like, boom, Nike and everything in your face. And this made sense to me. I don't know if there's an international public intellectual that I would recommend more highly for understanding what has happened to the world in terms of economic globalization, climate change, and just all of the fundamentals. She is the one person who has done the most to tie them all together. What I'm currently reading is this book right here. It's Rebecca Solnit. The book is called Orwell's Roses, and it's beautiful. I'm like halfway through it. She's really famous because she like basically invented the term mansplaining, but I don't want to reduce her to a particular, to whatever that suggests to you in your imagination. Of course, she is a feminist, etc. But Solnit is amazing. She has the most wide-ranging and delicate and serious kind of intellect and imagination, and she is a superb writing, and this book has it all. It's framed around George Orwell and a rose garden that people don't know about, but he really loved gardening. So it's about how can you expand Orwell and all of the things he thought about through the image of him in his garden. I also really admire Amitav Ghosh for effort he's making to combine his hugely successful like novelistic career with his belief that climate change is much too urgent for anyone to ignore. And what he's doing with his writing now is pretty inspiring. My kind of guilty secret is that what I really love reading is fiction.
Wow. Nice.
Shouldn't be, I'm like a journalist and like a non-fiction guy. So I should really feel like I should be just like reading all of the serious, all of the history. But I love fiction. Lots
We
of
were trying to normalize reading fiction on Chalchitra Talks because a lot of people who were initially our audience were all about non-fiction, and now we're just trying to pick up. We have a book a month thing. We pick up a book each month and we read it together as a community.
Oh,
And we've
really?
been picking up fiction most recently. We try chick flicks, we try contemporary fiction, we try classics, and we're just trying to get into fiction, all of us together.
Well, I mean, look, people have their own preferences. There's no need for anyone to do something that they don't enjoy. I think that like when it comes to reading is good for you. I feel that it's good for you intellectually and psychically. It's good for your nervous system. It's obviously good for your brain. But I think that everyone should read what they want. Fiction can touch certain nerves. for me that I'm curious about what you guys have been recommending.
This month we picked up a book, How Do You Live? But it did not get a lot of good reviews in the book club. Next month we're going to do a non-fiction, but we picked up The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which surprisingly a lot of people liked. We also picked up On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Wong.
I read that. It wasn't to my taste, I have to admit, but I know so many people who I love who find that book so beautiful. Things can be objectively good, but nothing is for everyone.
Right.
You know, there are people who think Moby Dick sucks. So you'd have to take comfort from that as a writer, which is like if someone doesn't like your book, it's fine. You also have to, it also means that you have to be tolerant of each other. Like we're often like, I don't want to be like, Ocean
Do you have
Wong is...
recommendations for us as to books that you would want us to pick up for a book a month?
Book that all of us have possibly read some snippet of because of our Indian curriculum, but most of us have no clue of the brilliance of, is Huckleberry Finn. It is a great, fun and unbelievably progressive and humane piece of literature. Now it's controversial because it uses the N word and is about a young white boy and an escaped adult slave and their friendship. And it is the most beautiful, but it is also the most directly touching critique of slavery that I have ever read. And Mark Twain is deservedly one of the geniuses of that century. If you're like trying to find a book that you're like, oh, I haven't been able to get into anything for ages, there's a book that seems to work as instant and guaranteed crack. And that is a book by Tara Westover called Educated. It's a memoir, I don't know where this came out of. It's a memoir of growing up in some kind of Christian fundamentalist household. I stake my reputation on the fact that everyone will finish the book. Try that out in your book club and you guys will have lots to talk about. The main thing will be like, how did she write such a good book? Ants Before Elephants is this book I hugely admire, which is a little bit harder work. So this is Sujata Gidla's family memoir about the previous generation, her uncle and parents growing up as Dalits in post-independence Telangana. So it starts around World War II. It is superbly well written and it just like throws open this scene of what communist movement, the Telangana movement against unbelievable caste oppression looked like. There's a writer named Madeline Miller who's written 2 books that are adaptations of Greek myth. One is the story of Achilles, told through the eyes of his lover, and the other is the story of Circe, who's actually a minor figure in the Odyssey. With the pleasure of reading, it's hard to think of a book that I would recommend more highly.
What about poetry? Do you also read and enjoy reading poetry?
I have friends who are very serious readers of poetry, and poetry is like the Mahabharata is poetry, the Homer is poetry, and then there's modern poetry in all different kinds. It can be something as simple and pleasurable as Vikram said. That's easy to recommend. The poetry that has most recently been that my eye has most recently like stayed on is actually A.K. Ramanujan was a brilliant language scholar and translator from Dharwad. He translated many different kinds of classical and medieval South Indian poetry. One of the wonderful things that there is to discover in Indian poetry of every era and of every region is that it's so fresh. It's still speaking to us. This is not like some vague stuff.
If I could ask you, what was in recent history or even before, what was the period of time in Indian politics that really did not let you sleep?
I was in college when the Gujarat massacres happened in 2002. And that was that was like a really defining event in my life. And it's still something I think about a lot, how that has become like an unsayable event. I thought that the period before the 2019 elections was pretty bizarre and ugly. Between February and the actual election, I thought that the quantity of distortion and control of the national discourse was crazy. But I don't want to focus on what was worst because that's like, that anyone could win that competition. The alternative, which is the best, is, and you can also treat this as a recommendation to anyone who's watching this, and who's kind of politically interested, is to not forget what happened between December of 2019 and February or March of 2020. The completely organic way in which people across the country and people across communities and classes found a similar language for what we wanted the country to look like, a true nationalism, the way our national symbols became redeemed in a way that I had never seen in my life, our flag, our constitution, our preamble. We haven't done enough to hold on to that amazing image of India that emerged then. There's nothing I would more recommend that you go back to with an open mind than what people were saying and what people were feeling together during that movement.
Do you think theatre also then plays an important role in perhaps allowing people? At this point, I'm thinking of all the nukkad nataks and the street plays that we do, and there are a lot many times that people, especially student bodies, have used street plays to talk about stuff that matters. Where do you think theatre comes in all of this?
I'm a big theatre groupie, uh, especially around the Bangalore theatre scene. Theatre was already faced certain challenges before the pandemic, and then the loss of live gatherings and live performance means that I haven't really seen a play in a long time. So I'm worried about theatre, and I miss it. And I don't think that Zoom theatre shows, which I saw a couple of, are necessarily going to fill the hole, because something essential about theatre is being in that gathering with other people and seeing the actors in front of you. I don't know where theatre now fits into the world of politics and movements, because there's still some questions that need to be answered about how theatre works now at all, you know.
Right.
We're back out on the streets, of course, so the nukkad natak can resume, but and I hope it does, but there are some deeper questions that I'm more fundamental questions for theatre that I'm curious about.
And if I may ask, what are those questions?
How do you make people watch a live performance and not look at their phones? You know, that might that is actually a pretty real one. What's the relevant way in which to get people to, especially since we're now, you know, like the conversation we've just had is so much about performance and storytelling that you can consume or you can receive in your own home, which is what we've all gotten so used to. Like, what is the form of theater that's really going to draw people back out and draw people together again? Will it be the same or will it be different? I have a feeling that it needs to be different, and it will be different.
And what is your hope for the world of theatre moving on?
One is that theater will be able to figure out how to tell stories about a technological world that are, you know, that are well told. Like, you know, the way some very important kind of milestone pieces of theater in India in the past talked about the world that people lived in, like whatever, Vijay Tendulkar and so on. The world we live in now is one that is so entangled with technology that there is a real technical question to answer about how theater tells contemporary stories. Just like with every other medium, there's a very interesting question about how novels should deal with technology, which I follow this question with great interest ever since I heard the novelist Eleanor Catton, who won the Booker Prize for The Lumineers back a couple of years ago. She was talking, so that's like a detective book, and she was talking about how she had to write a historical detective book because modern technology spoils so many of the elements of crime and detective fiction. You need to like write letters that can be lost, that cannot reach their destination. You need to have phone calls that can be missed, that people don't get. You know, there are all of these things that are the conventions and the essentials of these genres that are pre-technological. By and large, someone else said recently that mostly all fiction now is historical fiction, because it doesn't feature smartphones. So even when we're reading about contemporary fiction and it's about and it's set in the present, it's still effectively historical fiction because it doesn't register it doesn't register
How much of the time we spend
yeah,
on
online, and that puzzle of making online visible in other media, and also other media surviving the assault of online, is a big one. Lots of layers.
This reminds me of a book that we picked up this year for a book a month. It's called The Three Body Problem.
Yeah,
It has three parts, yes. So we picked up the first book in the series and it blew away a lot of us. And I
yeah.
didn't, because I don't really enjoy science fiction. I'm still trying to navigate my way into it. But my co-founder, Vaibhav, he read all the books and he was blown away for at least a month.
Yeah, that's very ambitious. I'm quite impressed. I thought about reading it too, but it seems intimidating.
Do you have any pointers as to maybe I missed something during the interview if you'd like to add something?
We haven't talked about TV shows.
Oh,
Oh
yes,
my,
I talked about TV shows, yes.
to two shows that I watched fairly recently. One is called I May Destroy You, which is not something you want to watch with your family necessarily. Very adult. It's also like trigger warning. It is about a woman who is seriously sexually assaulted at a party and about how she responds to that. I can't recommend it highly enough. Like, go check it out. The other show that I thought was so interesting to talk about. I mean, lots of things are great to watch. Sometimes we watch some Downton Abbey, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about is Handmaid's Tale. There was something in Handmaid's Tale that everyone should be watching right now and should be contemplating. I read the book by Margaret Atwood back when I was in college, but it didn't feel like an essential thing responding to the world we're in. Not only is this show a great adaptation of the book, I think it captures what the book does really well, and it's way easier to watch than you would think, given how difficult the subject is. Handmaid's Tale is a story about speech. I can't tell you how often I've been invited to debate or talk about free speech because I'm a journalist, right? And like the Jaipur Lit Fest, every year it ends with a session, a debate about free speech. And it is the worst thing that happens at Jaipur Lit Fest every single year, and they won't stop doing it. Why is it the worst thing and why do they keep doing it? Because no one ever says they're against free speech, right? So like free speech just becomes this completely hollow placeholder for people to talk about other things. Everyone's just like, I'm actually pro free speech. And then their agenda but that has nothing to do with free speech. Everyone's pro free speech. 90% of the debates and arguments that are about free speech out there are disingenuous arguments that aren't really about free speech at all. Handmaid's Tale, it's about a near future society in America, but it's easy to see here, in which a conservative militant movement has won. The essential thing about Handmaid's Tale is that free speech doesn't exist.
And how different is it from the book?
I read the book a long time ago, but I thought it didn't strike me as being very different. The feeling of it struck me as being very much the same. And the main, and that essential thing that it shoots like an electric current into you is the fear that the protagonists feel about saying, this is unfair. I don't like this. All of these things that we think of that are the very basic expression, the simplest expression of someone speaking about their oppression is forbidden. And of course, because this is what happens when free speech is forbidden, the other fear is that if you say to someone, they will condemn you, which means that you can't trust anyone. Handmaid's Tale really rings true and feels totally essential to understand as a kind of political exercise, as well as just a great show.
I just have one last question before we go, and it's one question that I like to ask everyone. Maria Popova is an author. She runs the Brain Pickings, and she's written an article about building pockets of stillness in your life. And I like to ask everyone what their pockets of stillness are. These could be books, music, movies, destinations, people, or things you like to do when, the going gets tough.
There's a lot of change in my life right now, so I'm still sort of searching for that. I keep completely understand what she means by it. One of the reasons that I value reading books and that one of the things that reading fiction does for me is that it definitely provides a pocket of stillness and a certain kind of steadiness, which comes when you're just doing the one thing of moving through a story. The way you spend time with people you love can provide a pocket of stillness if you use it a certain way. Making time for real conversation with, or even just for quiet with someone that you love is a very refreshing pocket of stillness. I think that walking provides a pocket of stillness that people have acknowledged for a long time. It's been part of meditative practice. There's a reason that like bhikkhus walk all the time.
Thank you so much, Raghu, for doing this. I'm so glad we were finally able to connect and sit down and have this laid back conversation as well.
Thank you guys for watching this. And if you've enjoyed it, please subscribe to Chalchitra Talks.